ain't bad at all. Sucker, it's twisted and way. Twisted up. I don't know how good you can see these warps and bends. Otherwise, the teeth are absolutely perfect yet on these aftermarket hardened. They're a hardened bar that's welded up with hardened steel. That's almost 4,000 acres, and it still looks like brand new. If it wasn't for the fact that they were starting to crack and get too twisted up, I get 10,000 acres out of these things. So if I was in a non-rocky area, I'd probably spend the money again on aftermarket welded up bars versus the aftermarket OEM replacement bars. Here's the rasp bars going in. On these old Deeres, it isn't so bad. There's just a couple things we want to check. On your bars, how do you know when they're shot is when they start getting real short. When they start getting real short this way, any damage like what I've got where they're all bent and twisted to heck, they're starting to crack, things like that. But for the most part, when they get real short both ways, then it's time to change them out. The concave itself, we come in the concave and you can see like right on that leading edge. I wonder if I can pick a different. Sorry, I dropped you. You can see that leading edge where the weld line is. So that's how much they built it up. And that concave, this is one of them St. John's. I don't think they're no longer in business. Like I said, you got well over 3,000, just shy of 4,000 acres on this concave. A lot of rock have been through this sucker, and the concave clearly wins over the rasp bars, and that's fine by me. That's fine by me. But we checked that. What happens if this leading edge gets too rounded? Then you lose that energy to quickly rub the kernels off the cob, and you start to get more of a mush factor of the kernels rolling over that edge, and that's when you start to get a lot of grain damage as soon as it starts getting tough combining. Where with new bars and a sharp concave, when you get into tough conditions, you still get a good grain tank sample. So if you're in super good conditions, it should be very easy to dial in, and you should have no problem going from field to field. If If it becomes very fussy from field to field, or even in good conditions, you're having a real hard time getting the cob clean, that's an indicator that either the bars or the concave or both are wear, or the concave is out of square. And so what we'll do is, when the new bars is in, we'll take one bar and you just measure over here, and you measure here, and you measure here, and you measure over there, right underneath the spiders, and to make sure that the concave isn't bowed and that the concave isn't leaning to one side on this front corner. Then you can roll up a bar to that top back side and do the same thing. You can just stick your hand up in there and feel on the edges on the back side on the deers, these old cylinder deers, you know, like the 88, the 66 through 88 20s and the 9000 series, you know, your 9500s and 10s and 50s on walker machines. You had an inspection port on the side. You just stick a piece of key stock in on each side to make sure that the back of the concave is square as well. So there's just a couple little things. You want to check these spiders while you're apart here. Check these spiders for cracks where they hook to the shaft. And then in super dry, one other member was talking about this. In super dry corn, if all you're doing is combining 16% corn every day, guys would pull every other wire. Pull that wire, pull that wire, pull that wire, pull that wire. And that lets the concave open up so that dry grain can just get through the concave better. It puts less of a load on your cleaning system in the back as much. Since the grain falls earlier in the concave, well, so you pull every other wire. That way the grain gets through the concave quicker with less risk of over thrashing and grain damage, and it just makes that much more of an animal. If all I had to do was combine dry corn all day long, I'd do 3,000 bushel an hour with this thing. It wouldn't even be funny. Right now in 25% corn with only 200 horsepower, I can still get 2,000 bushel an hour all day long if I really wanted to push it. The only problem is with the 8-row head, that's where the horsepower on this one shows that we only got the couple hundred horse, because with the 8-row head in 180 bushel corn, our ground speed starts to be the big horsepower hog, not the thrashing. So if I had a 12-row head, you know, remember John Deere, 12-row capable since 1979. If I had the 12-row head on here, you bet I'd do 2,500 bushel an hour at 2 and 3 miles an hour. That'd be a fantastic matchup. But yeah, so there's just them key things when you're putting in new rasp bars. Get each one in and loose. Don't tighten anything till they're all in. And then you got to give it a spin. Give it a spin. Make sure you find a heavy spot. Hopefully there is no heavy spots. They will show up rather easily if there is a slight heavy spot. But yeah, so it's pretty basic. I don't know, they're just your normal wear parts. Get a tech manual if it's a question on any specs or anything. But that's kind of just the basics of the inner of the combine here. Guys, for the most part, keeping a combine going is pretty simple as far as the theories and logic. They're expensive and they are high maintenance. You got to keep ahead of that stuff. It don't have to be stressful. I take combine adjusting very seriously, and I thrive on doing a very good job. I love the fact that I can combine an 8-row head and just run over that 8-row head in corn and hardly have a kernel out the back of the combine, hardly have a kernel on the ground from the head. You know, you throw a loss hoop out there and you're lucky to be at a half to 1 bushel. Same on the bean head, which considering the age of the equipment is pretty stinking phenomenal. You know, in good beans, when we get going in 50 bushel beans, I can sit here at 4.5 miles an hour all day long and just go. If they're super green stems in tough conditions, then you pull back on the hydro and you just go accordingly. Combined next to a 1688, I would believe, was the bigger number to compete against the 8820. He had a 30-foot table just like I did. There was a lot of thick green grass in the field, some foxtail, and there was a lot of giant ragweed out there. It was a disaster. There was a lot of times you couldn't see a bean out the cab, but they were pouring in the grain tank, and it was as clean as seed in the grain tank. But that 1688, I'm going 4.5 miles an hour, and in the same field, he is going 200 feet, stop, let it clean out. There's a big pile on the ground for the farmer to now have to deal with. Go another couple hundred feet, stop, big pile on the ground. And I don't believe it was an issue of the combine. I believe, yep, we can talk about design flaws, and we can argue red versus green, and the fact that his combine in them tough conditions, that was a weak spot of that combine. But if he would have had good sharp elephant ears, or even an aftermarket Kyle parts for the intake of that rotor, good square rasp bars and good sharp concaves, I believe he would have been hanging right next to me, or as close as he could have. He definitely has more horsepower, there's no doubt about it. I think at that time the binder was 30 or 40 horse more. It should have ran circles around me, but we did 40 acres that night before he did 10. I mean, it was ridiculous. He worked all day. He worked all day to get a 30 done. I came in after work, the combine was sitting there, and I did 30 that night in a couple hours after work, and left, and he was still working on that same field. That just goes to show, and the losses behind that combine. You pretty much had the seed for next year's bean field out there. So that's why it's important to do this stuff. Do your research on your particular combine. There's some great aftermarket stuff out there. Do some Google searching for aftermarket parts for your combine to improve the thrashing capacity on these Deeres. One big thing is I run without the cylinder filler plates, because it just helps me be just an absolute beast in soybeans and corn up to that 25-ish%. Above that, I have to start being careful. If I really wanted to go crazy in super high moisture corn, I'll put concave fillers in and probably put the filler plates back in. But for the most time, since we sit right around that 25% for harvest, maybe even a little bit drier, it works awesome without them filler plates in. And so there's just little tricks like that. But yeah, do some Google searching about your combine for the aftermarket upgrades that are in there, because it is well worth it. If you're running slugs and stuff through, that starts at the cutting head. But if the combine is just working that hard, how much extra fuel is that costing you per acre? If you're losing an extra bushel out the back just because it's just working that extra hard, that's $10 an acre on beans. And belts, if you're blowing belts and stuff, you know, there's downtime and whatnot, and you're trying to beat rain. So it's really in your guys' best interest that own combines to study up on them as best as you can. Read that owner's manual, make notes to yourself about the settings that you ran this year and the conditions that you were in. So then next year you have something to fall back on, and then after a couple of years you'll have that beast dialed in, and you'll be running. But yeah, so guys, I'm going to keep picking away at this, and all right, thank you. When you're doing this, get yourself a little alignment punch. So we got one bolt that comes through the front. Got one bolt that comes through the front with a nut on it, and the other bolt is fine thread that screws into the bar itself. With that fine thread, we never touch nothing with an impact gun until we know we can get several turns by hand, because that fine thread is way too easy to strip out or cross thread. I mean, not strip out. Way too easy to cross thread. This is one of them jobs that you just take your time. If you're upset when you take it to your dealer and it runs several more hours than you think, that's why, because he's fighting all this stuff as it goes together. You end up fighting it more and more, but you gotta use an alignment bar. So I've got all these in except this one, and you can see the hole isn't even lined up there. So that's part of the fight there. So then we just put a little pry on that bar to get that to line up. We tighten these up by hand or with the gun, just kind of bounce the gun a little bit just to snug them up. We don't want to tighten them, we just want to snug them up so the bar is up in position. And then we can move it around and it should be in position then, so these all just kind of fall into place. But it's not a very fast job. It's one of them jobs, just take your time, relax, put on some good music, have some water, have your buddy pull up a chair and visit with you, whatever, but just take your time and do it right. So I got one that no matter what I did, I just could not get it to go. You turn them in that turn or two and they're getting stiff, and so then you pull out the small hand wrench and you give it some feel by the hand wrench, and you can feel that it's still smooth on the threads even though you can't turn it by hand. But that one, you'd turn several turns and all of a sudden, just dead stop. So, and we're not, instead of getting the impact gun and just driving it through, we're going to get a tap and we're going to chase it through, and you can see some filings falling. We're just going to chase it, and then we'll try putting the bolt in. Oh yeah, look at there. Now with fingers I can just turn that sucker right down to the lock washer. So that is beautiful. So got one in and 6 more to go.